Good evening, everybody. Dear Deputy Director of the General Directorate for Heritage and Museums, dear Madam Cultural Attaché, dear representatives of the Ministry for Culture and Tourism, dear museum directors, dear speakers, and dear colleagues. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome you to the workshop Protection of Cultural Heritage in Emergency Situations. A workshop that was organized by the British Institute at Ankara in collaboration with the American Research Institute in Turkey, the US Embassy, and the Erimtan Museum. And I would like to take immediately the opportunity to thank all of the collaborators very much for all their work and support. But this workshop would not have come into being if we would not have had the guidance and direction and support from the General Directorate of Heritage and Museums from the Ministry of Culture and Tourism of the Republic of Turkey. The aim of this workshop is to address issues and to work on strategies for protecting museums and heritage sites in instances of disaster. And with instances of disasters, we are thinking about a very wide range of possibilities unfortunately possibilities. We are talking both about natural disasters, natural sources of hazard, as well as human-induced sources of hazards, with whom the Turkish immediate neighbours have so much experience, unfortunately. For this, we thought it would be good to bring together international experts with specialists at the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, museums, institutes and universities in Turkey to address a wide range of issues that can damage or possibly even obliterate cultural and historical heritage. We hope that this workshop will provide an introduction to a variety of work at sites and museums in different regions and in different contexts. We would like to start the workshop tonight with a lecture by Professor Peter Stone. And Peter has also agreed to answer questions after his lecture. And then afterwards, Mr. Melik Ayaz from the General Directorate of Heritage and Museums is going to give a welcome speech to all of us. Let me introduce Professor Peter Stone to you then. Peter is the UNESCO's Chair in Cultural Property Protection and Peace at Newcastle University. He also is the Chair of the UK Committee of Blue Shield and Secretary of Blue Shield International. He was previously head of the School of Arts and Cultures and Professor of Heritage Studies at the International Centre for Cultural and Heritage Studies at Newcastle University. Before joining Newcastle University, however, he had worked at English Heritage, also as a field archaeologist and as a history teacher. So quite a varied career, I think we can say. In 2003, he was advisor to the Ministry of Defence regarding the identification and protection of the archaeological cultural heritage in Iraq. He has remained active in working with the military to refine attitudes and develop processes for the better protection of cultural property in times of conflicts, and has also written extensively on this topic. Today's lecture will trace developments in attitudes towards protection of cultural property during conflict, as well as outline the importance and impact of the organization Blue Shield to raise the profile of cultural property protection. And I would like to invite Peter to the speaker.
I normally say at this point in lectures when I'm speaking overseas, and it is all the more pertinent now, thank you for letting me speak English, because I only speak English. And my family tell me I don't speak English particularly well either. But I'm often reminded of the British diplomat in the 19th century who was decided that he wanted a particular job in a particular unnamed country, and his civil servant said to him, "But sir, you don't speak that language." And he said, "Rubbish! Of course I speak that language. I speak every language in the world. I just speak English more loudly and more slowly, and everybody understands me." I think that's proof from this, just what we've seen, that that's not necessarily the case. Anyway, thank you very much for allowing me to come and speak to you. There are two logos on the slide in front of you. On the far side is the UNESCO logo and Newcastle University, and that relates to me being the UNESCO Chair of Cultural Property Protection and Peace at Newcastle. But that does not mean that I speak for UNESCO. I am not a UNESCO employee. I am there, as we frequently say, a critical friend to try and help UNESCO and try and work with them to deliver their strategies and their policies. The other logo that you see in the centre of the slide is the logo of the Blue Shield, an organisation that I will come back to later in the presentation, but those are the two there. Critical responsibility or unnecessary distraction? Well, I think it's probably quite obvious from before I start which side of that fence I fall on, but it is not necessarily a clear distinction that many people take. And as with so many people, I think, in the room, my involvement in this, as we've heard before, started in 2003 in response to the coalition invasion of Iraq. Interestingly, in that invasion, no coalition troops had any orders to protect any museums, galleries, libraries or archaeological sites or any cultural property at all. And as everybody who has ever had any connection with the military will know, if the military don't get an order to do something, it doesn't happen. The next astonishing statement is that none of those sites were marked on any combat military maps. So when colleagues from the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad went 2 days after the fall of Baghdad to plead with the American military to go and protect the National Museum, they had to show them where it was on their maps. They had no idea. And there was, in that coalition invasion, extraordinarily limited capability of any understanding of culture or cultural property protection. And when I say extraordinarily limited, that is probably, you could count the people who had any of that responsibility on the fingers of one, possibly two hands. And that's about where we were. We were also at a stage where neither of the two main combatants on the coalition side had ratified the primary piece of international legislation, the 1954 Hague Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict, or either of its protocols of 1954 or 1999. An astonishing state of affairs. And then on the 29th of January, a Wednesday, at a tea break in the Ministry of Defence, this question was asked from one of the team to his senior officer. And the response to this was, "Yeah, I know a bloke, I'll ask him at the weekend." And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, I was that bloke, and I got caught into dealing with this in that ridiculously short 5 or 6 weeks before the actual invasion, where we could do almost no good at all, because all troops were already deployed, they all had their orders, they all knew what they were doing, and none of them were doing cultural property protection. We all know what happened. Every museum was looted, every storeroom was looted for all various reasons, and there was massive looting of archaeological sites, across much of the country, but in particular in the south. And that went on for much of the next decade. A terrible catastrophe, as one of the many exhibitions about this was titled at the time. So what went wrong? Well, I mean, there are whole books and libraries now written on what went wrong with the invasion of Iraq. But I want to pick out 3-4 things. Firstly, there were simply not enough troops deployed to do the job. When Donald Rumsfeld called in the American generals to go and invade, to go and plan to invade Iraq, they said, "We don't have to do that, sir. We've got plans to invade Iraq already. What we need to do is for you to tell us what you want us to do in that invasion. So what's the end result? What we can tell you now is the minimum number of troops we need is 300,000. Okay? There was then a nearly year battle between the chiefs of staff and the Pentagon, and they eventually invaded with 148,000. In other words, less than half the minimum number the military had said they needed. There was a complete and utter failure to understand what might go on in post-Saddam Hussein Iraq. I'm not going to go into that at all, but I think we can all take that as an exception. And there was a complete failure on 2 counts. One, to understand the importance of cultural heritage and religious heritage and that side of activity in the Middle East. And equally, there was a complete and utter failure to understand some of the historical relationships and issues that went hand in hand with a British army invading Iraq again. And as many Iraqis perceived, we were invading again. And the reaction in many parts was exactly the same as the reaction that there had been in Afghanistan. We've beaten these guys 3 or 4 times, when are they going to learn? But here they are back for more, effectively. So all of those things were critical parts. The 4th reason, though, was our failure. And our failure to interact with the military, because you cannot blame the military for allowing things to be damaged and destroyed if you don't tell the military what is important, why it's important, and why they should be taking time out of their normal day work to protect it. And we failed with that enormously. And that was a surprise, because if you have your commanding officer writing this, and I'll just leave you for a minute to read that quote, and it will be translated as we're reading it in English. Okay.
Wait.
Much longer in Turkish. Okay, it's the responsibility of every commander, okay? Every commander. Wouldn't it be nice if that had been written by Tommy Franks in 2003 or even Norm Schwarzkopf in 1991? In fact, it was written by Dwight Eisenhower in 1944. And in the Second World War, there was a very close relationship between the heritage sector and the military, epitomised by the so-called monuments men, which some of you may have seen the appalling film by George Clooney. Why he had to choose the monuments men a serious issue to make his worst ever film, I still don't quite understand, but he did. But the monuments men did a huge amount of good in the Italian campaigns in North Africa and in mainland Europe. Fascinatingly, being created for 2 totally different reasons. And if anybody's interested in that, please ask me in the questions at the end. But totally different genesis in the US and in the UK. But here, one of them helping move a medieval statue from a damaged church in Belgium. But in fact, that relationship between the heritage sector and the military, or at least the understanding of the military about the importance of heritage, went way back before then, even to the First World War. The first thing, or one of the first things that General Allenby did when he, depending on which view you have, liberated, occupied, protected Jerusalem in 1917, when the British did one of those things, was to deploy troops to protect all cultural and religious monuments. And he did that for two reasons. One, because he knew that the protection of such sites was very important and they needed to do that. And secondly, a purely military issue, he had an army of troops sitting in Jerusalem doing nothing, and if he knew that if they weren't given tasks to do, they would get restless and there would be problems. So it was a military response as well. But somebody on Allenby's staff was thinking in a way that nobody in 2003 in America or the UK was thinking. Because the troops he deployed to protect the mosques in Jerusalem were not British troops, but they were Muslim troops of the British Indian Army. And he purposefully selected Christian troops to protect Christian monuments and Muslim troops to protect Islamic monuments. Somebody was thinking, and it's that relationship, that level of thought process that had completely disappeared, and part of that responsibility we must take as the cultural heritage sector. So what have we learned since 2003? Well, not possibly as much as we would have liked to have done. The first thing is people first. Nobody, as far as I know, on this side of cultural property protection would say, save that object before that person. That's not what we are about. I would certainly never say that. I would certainly never put anybody's life at risk to protect an object. We have to put people first. But also, let's not forget that people carry with them intangible cultural heritage. And if you allow people to be killed, then you are also losing cultural heritage, although it's not the physical object, it's the intangible cultural heritage. You have to work with the military, long-term, right to short-term. You have to understand the constraints under which the military act. The first thing that it took me quite a long time to get my head around, even though everybody knows it, is that the military don't decide to go to war. Politicians decide to send the military to war. And that conversation I just reported with Rumsfeld gives an understanding of some of that issue. We need to understand the military's priorities. We mustn't talk down to them, as many of us did in 2002 and 2003, saying, how dare you do that, that was terrible. That just gets nobody anywhere. We need to build a realistic partnership for mutually useful end results, and that critical word, partnership. And if we have learnt that since 2003, that's a major step forward. This is also extremely topical. It was only in March of this year that the UN passed its first Security Council resolution specifically about protection of cultural property. It's an awful shame that they missed out the one paragraph that would have been really useful, which was putting countries, encouraging all countries to make sure that their militaries took the responsibilities under the 54 Convention properly, but we can't have everything. But it's a completely topical issue at the moment. So, are they, just to sort of nail this one completely, are they as important as people? No. The catastrophe of everything that's going on at the moment in the Middle East is not the loss of the Temple of Baal or other things like that. It is that. That is the catastrophe. That is what we must be trying to address as an international community. But with that, and very closely second, comes the protection of their cultural heritage and their cultural property. So why is it important? Well, the first reason I always say is an individual without a memory is a dysfunctional individual. They have to be helped, they have to be supported, and that comes with a cost. In much of the same way, a community without a memory also has to be supported and can become, very quickly, a dysfunctional community. Now, that's not saying at all that all community memory is good. Much of it is bad. But just as every individual has to cope with their past and their memories and their actions in the past, so communities need to be able to do that as well and come to a mutually acceptable way of moving forward. Cultural property, a second issue, is frequently a stage upon which cultural heritage is acted out. And if you don't have that stage, you lose part of, quite often, nationhood and nation building and national tradition. So just as one silly example, the state openings of Parliament, almost anywhere in the world, are fully involved in the trappings in particular places with particular bits of intangible cultural heritage that go with them. And I always tell my students that we study the past to understand the present, to help create the future. If we don't have the tangible evidence of the past, and if we've allowed people to be killed to lose the intangible cultural heritage, then that circle is a very difficult one to complete. So those are just some of those general reasons. This slide is the introductory slide of a whole lecture, and I'm not going to go through it in any detail at all. But you can break that down into a number of other reasons that cultural property is good to protect, from the likes of academics like me who have got a particular site they want to excavate and learn from, right down to the reasons that it's important for the military. And if we don't deal with those ones, then we're not going to get the ones higher up that line looked at in any way. So let's focus in on why it's important to the military. Well, the first thing is the protection of cultural property is a legal responsibility for the military under international humanitarian law, under international human rights law, and under international customary law. They have got to do it legally. And regardless of whether they have actually signed up to particular bits of convention or legal statute or treaty, they are all responsible legally under international customary law. Second reason from a military point of view is, as I've said, the military don't decide to go to a war, politicians do. And the political use and misuse of heritage is a key issue that the military need to understand when they are put into a situation that it is going to be a complex situation with that going on. An increasing amount of evidence is coming out that from the fighting in Afghanistan in the 1980s, when the Afghans were fighting the Russians, is some of the first good evidence that there has been of some funding of the so-called insurgencies being funded by the looting of archaeological sites and the sale of archaeological objects. If you see a figure put to that, then don't believe it, because nobody has any idea how much money is actually brought through on that area. Some of the more exaggerated figures in terms of what Daesh are collecting in the tens of millions, if not billions, are certainly nonsense. Equally, it is more than a few $100,000. But as one military person put it to me a few months ago, even $100,000 US buys an awful lot of bullets And if that's the really bottom end, that's something that the military have worked out. They really don't want to give the opposition the opportunity of doing. The economic value of cultural property is based on, for example, the World Bank did a report on the MENA region, and the primary bit of economy for the MENA region after oil and gas was tourism, and 80% of the economy for tourism is based on cultural tourism. People are coming to see the cultural property sites in the Middle East and North Africa. If, it goes without saying, those are allowed to be blown up and destroyed and damaged, then that whole economic agenda goes out of the window, and tourism suffers dramatically, as does the economic stability of a country post-conflict. And this is where you need, in a way, to get slightly into the mindset of the military, because two key things that the military want to do are go in and out of a conflict area as quickly as possible with as few casualties as possible. And one of the things that they really don't want to do is hang around in a country for a long time being policemen. And one of the issues that we've had recently is they have been stuck in country a lot longer than anybody wanted them to be, because the countries aren't stable enough. Now, they're not stable enough for all sorts of reasons, but one facet of that is the lack of stability for bringing in tourism. And then there's this whole military concept of is something what they call a force multiplier, something that can give, that can make their job easier in what they may do. Sadly, there are lots and lots of examples of areas where the military have taken decisions and have made the situation worse. And I could give you examples of those if people are interested in questions. There are a couple of examples, and I will give you one later, of where the military have taken a decision which has done a positive thing. And what they're trying to do now is build that into their thinking so that cultural property used as a force multiplier, or quite often referred to as soft power, will get the military a better relationship with the local community. And it's that sort of relationship that they're looking for, as opposed to some of the disastrous ones that they've had recently. But it's war. Things get damaged, get real, Pete, is what many of my colleagues and friends have said. But if you actually go back to military theory, and you can go back about 2,500 years for this, military theorists have been saying for that length of time that it is actually really, really bad military practice to allow cultural property of your enemy to be destroyed, or even worse, to allow your own troops to destroy it. Why? Two reasons. One, if you are trying to occupy, creating a population which is incredibly difficult and antagonistic against you to govern. And secondly, you are creating the first excuse for the next conflict. You blew up my temple, we're going to blow up yours. And that is an issue that has gone through for many years. And again, if people are interested, I could go into more there. So can't we do anything? Which is where I come to this second emblem, the Blue Shield. An organisation, or the Blue Shield emblem, set up in 1954 as the emblem of the 1954 convention. But the organisation set up in anticipation in 1996 of the second protocol, which was created in 1999. It was reconfigured, and I won't bore you with the detail unless anybody's really interested in questions, reconfigured in 2016 with new statutes and a new agenda, or a modified agenda. We work within the framework and positive area of the Hague Convention, but also within the context as set by the UN and UNESCO, and that broader umbrella of UNESCO aspirations. That's a fantastic set of aspirations to deliver and develop, but one of the problems with UNESCO is it has almost no staff and it has probably less money to go around. So it's a great aspirational organisation setting an agenda, but it has a great difficulty actually delivering a lot of that agenda. And again, I can talk a little bit more about that if people want to. We cover all cultural property, and we are non-governmental, and the critical bit there, entirely voluntary based, which is all for the good because we have no money at the moment. And we are a truly international organisation. This is a member of the CPP unit in the Cambodian Armed Forces. So there are a number of countries around the world who have got these guys in uniform in Cambodia, mainly retired officers who understand the military mindset, but also understand the heritage side of the issues as well. We try and work around 6 areas of activity, and I'll touch on these very quickly in the rest of my presentation. So policy development coordination, proactive protection training, emergency response and long-term support. I'll just pick out some areas of this. Policy development. It took me about a decade of trying to work with the military to come up with writing an article in 2013 that I first put into an archaeological journal and then had reprinted in something that is referred to, interestingly, as the Thinking Officers Journal, the British Army Review. I'm not sure what non-thinking British officers read, but still. And this was just simply outlining the 4 times that we should highlight where there needed to be a really close relationship. But actually, if you look at those 4 different times, it's a complete circle. All 4 of them are going on at the same time quite frequently. Okay? So it's not just a simple progression, it's something that's going on all the time. Long-term awareness. Everybody in uniform needs to know that in extremis, cultural property protection may save their life and the lives of their buddies. And if they get that, that's the only thing we want them to understand. We don't want every soldier in uniform to be a cultural property protection specialist. That would be lovely, but that's never going to happen. We need rank and responsibility related training. But that very simple message, everybody needs to get. And they need to understand that there is somebody else in uniform, if we get the process right, that knows enough that they can go to and ask about what they do. There is specific pre-deployment about a country. This army is going to deploy to this country. We need to know all about its heritage. This army is actually the army of this country, and there may be somebody else coming to aggressively deploy in their country. Do they know all about their own heritage and what is important to protect and not? There is the during conflict period where there needs to be somebody in uniform acting as the conscience of the military commander and making a military distinction between military necessity, which is allowed to destroy things, and military convenience, which is absolutely not allowed to destroy things. And that officer's voice needs to be constantly saying to the legal advisor and the commander-in-chief, "Sir, is this military necessity?" And that message keeps needing to be there. And then probably the most important, or one of the most, all areas are important, the other area, post-conflict or stabilisation. And that's where quite frequently the military are the only organisation in the area who have got the capacity to do anything effective. They're the only people with, for example, heavy lifting equipment. They're the only people who might be able to reach back and bring some chemicals needed to protect something else. And again, I could give you examples. We need to expand that to other areas. But the impact of that article, which was published in December 2013 in the British Army Review was that in January 14, I was sitting in my office in Newcastle, minding my own business, and the phone went, and the voice at the other end said, Prof Stone, you don't know me, but we need to speak. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Tim Purbrick from RBHQ. And Tim had been going through the December issue of British Army Review to check that his article was in it, and had noticed mine, had read it in the bath, and thought, yeah, this is something that we should be doing. And bizarrely, he was the right person in the right place, because one of his tasks for the British headquarters was what they call scoping, which is, in other words, what are the things that the military should be doing but they're not doing, and hence that conversation. And yesterday, before I got on the plane to come here, I was at another meeting of the now Joint Force Working Group to develop a UK Joint Force-wide cultural property protection unit in all three services of about 15 to 20 trained officers doing the work that was done in the Second World War and before. That had a real impact, but we have also seen that impact in a number of other countries who have taken it on. Again, stuff gets damaged, get real. Well, does it have to get damaged? And if you actually break down why things are damaged during conflict, there are at least 7 different reasons. And again, I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but one of the reasons, as we saw in Iraq, lack of planning. There was just nobody who had any orders, a lack of understanding. Not something that is majorly an issue anymore at the moment, especially where you've got 2 sort of regular armies fighting each other, but it's spoils of war, looting by armies of people's cultural property. Lack of military awareness, there are countless examples of that, unfortunately, if only they'd thought or if they'd only asked. There is so-called collateral damage, but let me come back to that in a moment. So collateral damage, where you know you have to blow up this building and this historic building next to it may get damaged at the same time. That's there, but we'll come back to that. Looting is an endemic issue and one that the military are beginning to take awareness of. There's what we call enforced neglect. So when people like me can't do our job, and when, normally when I used to work for English Heritage, we would do a 6-monthly review of all of our buildings that had got roofs on. And if a tile had slipped, we'd make sure the tile was put back. But if you can't do that, then the tile not only slips a little bit, but falls off the roof. That's when the weather gets in, and that's when the real damage to that building happens. So it's that sort of activity. And then there is the specific targeting that we've seen in the Balkans and in Iraq and Syria. All of those, my contention is, can be addressed and mitigated down so that we lower the overall risk to cultural property. Coordination is a word that a number of people get very worried about because they think that the Blue Shield is trying to take over the world. Absolutely not. It's not coordination of everybody else, it's coordination with everybody else. And just one example of this, NATO have a series of what they call centres of excellence, where a group of military from a variety of NATO countries work together to deal with one particular issue. And the Civilian Military Centre of Excellence, that looks at the relationship between the civilians and the military, I worked with them on a 9-year project which went through 3 directors of this CIMIC Centre, but to come up with a book critically written by people in uniform for people in uniform, which has so much more value than being written by Prof Stone, effectively, telling the military what they should do. This is the military telling the military what they should do, and it's called Cultural Property Protection. Makes sense, and it's a sort of easy read, 2 hours in the evening book with lots of illustrations and things, and it's available free download. So just collaborating, working with people, because we can't do it, obviously, all. And I'm only picking out some examples, obviously. Lots of others are doing similar things. Proactive protection and collateral damage. One of the things that Blue Shield has done, and in particular the US National Committee of the Blue Shield, has come up with lists of cultural property in countries that the international community and the archaeologists and other heritage professionals of those countries would prefer not to be damaged in a conflict if at all possible. And we've done them now for too many countries in the Middle East, unfortunately. We produced one for Libya, and when the NATO air campaign started in Libya, a few weeks into that campaign, a targeteer for NATO identified 6 vehicles that belonged to a mobile radar unit that had been put close to and inside a large building by forces loyal to President Gaddafi. And so that was deemed to be a target. Now, I don't know the detail of what happened next, but the equivalent of a red light flashed on his or her computer, because the coordinates for that large building were the same coordinates that we had given them for a Roman building that we had said we would prefer not to be damaged if at all possible. So within the military, the decision-making process about A, whether that should be a target or not, and B, how to destroy it, went up the ranks. And eventually the decision was taken, yes, it must be a target, but that they would, in military speak, modify the ordnance. So in other words, instead of choosing the big bomb which had originally been chosen by the targeteer to blow up all 6 vehicles at the same time and by chance the building, they used 6 precision weapons to destroy each of those vehicles. And here is one of those vehicles in front of the building, and believe me, the other 5 look exactly the same. They are all twisted piles of metal, with, apart from a little bit of shrapnel damage, a completely extant Roman building still there behind. We got an archaeological colleague from Libya in front of the international press a few days after we had this photograph taken, and suddenly NATO were the recipient of something that they were very, very unfamiliar with, which was good publicity. And they were so shocked about getting all of this good publicity that they set up an internal inquiry as to what they'd done right. And that process reported in December 2012, and the key recommendation of that was that NATO itself should create a cultural property protection policy. Now, that you could say is astonishing that they didn't have one. Well, they didn't, and therefore it's a good step in the right direction. It's also an astonishing statement because most NATO deployments rely not on a NATO policy or doctrine, but on the individual doctrines of the 10 countries that are in that particular NATO operation. So to have a NATO-level doctrine is a very interesting and important step forward. Of course, that happened in 2012. We're not there yet, but we are still talking, and again I was talking with somebody from NATO yesterday, and that seems to be moving forward as a process, so that soon that may actually be real. Fourth area is training. We've worked up a 3-day training course at the invitation of UNESCO to do this, and it covers many of the things that we've already, or I've already mentioned. Why cultural property is important, the importance of cultural property protection to the military operation, not the academics who want their archaeological site or whatever to be saved, but why it is important to the military. Some of the reasons it's damaged and destroyed, how you might avoid that without compromising the military mission, and really driving home the military responsibility of CPP. Fifth area, emergency response, and we are a long, long way away from getting this right, and we're not going to get it right until we've got some funding. So there's a big issue there. But the only reason that we got the photograph of the destroyed vehicles at Ras Al Maghreb in Libya was because 3 people from Blue Shield went in and started looking around what was going on. And then there are a whole heap of issues around long-term support, again, that I won't bore you with, but they're all there. It's, again, the things really we've been talking about. It's coordination, it's training, it's policy development, publications, and we may need some money to try and do some of all of this. So those are the 6 areas, and I've nearly finished. There are a lot of other things going on in this world, and by no means do I claim that Blue Shield is the sort of lead in much of this. There is a whole broader UNESCO context. There are issues that have been highlighted from the problems in Syria. So there is the whole, what I'm beginning to call the Palmyra complex. The immediate knee-jerk reaction of UNESCO and Russia to say, we will go in and rebuild. Well, why are we doing that, and why are we trying to prioritise that, and what's it really all about? And there are so many complicated questions around that that's something that we need probably decades to work out, rather than jump in immediately now. As a response, though, to the destruction of some of the ancient sites at Palmyra, the UK created a £30 million cultural protection fund. And this slide is slightly out of date. The French kick-started an international fund which has now got, I think, around 70 million promised to it. Yes? 77 million promised to it. There has been, not the first by any means, but another high-profile conviction of somebody for damage to cultural property protection. Mr. Al-Mahdi, who was in charge of the destruction of 9 mausolea and 1 mosque in Timbuktu, was prosecuted and convicted at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, not under the Hague Convention, but under the Rome Statute. And interestingly, and completely sort of from an unexpected quarter, and to be honest, from somebody who I didn't even know existed before she emailed me, but the UN Special Rapporteur for Cultural Rights, who works under the UN legislation around human rights, said that she wanted to raise the whole issue of protecting cultural property and cultural heritage of the human rights legal agenda. And she made a presentation to the UN General Assembly in October of last year, and we're going back to Geneva in a few weeks' time to build that and move that on to the next step. So there is lots going on elsewhere. Is this important? Is this an issue? Why are we really worried? This is a satellite image taken in 2011 of a major Roman site in Syria. 8 months later, the same satellite went over top, and that was the image that it took. Those are all looters' holes. We have no idea what came out of those looters' holes, but every single one of them could have and would have brought out material, that would have given us a significant understanding, if it had been properly archaeologically excavated, of what goes on and what went on in Roman Syria. But also, nearly all of that material is now being channeled into the trade in illicit antiquities. And some of that money will be going back to fund Daesh. Okay? So there is a real long-term commitment. Is it important? I asked these 2 guys, 2 of the curators of one of the libraries in Timbuktu that was badly damaged. Luckily, most of the libraries and most of the archives in Timbuktu were saved because they are not state-owned, but they are still owned by families. And the families, when they knew that Timbuktu was being threatened, went in, collected their material and took it out either down to Bamakan or into the desert, which they'd done countless times before over the centuries, and buried it until the threat went away, and then they just redug it up and brought it back. But ask these guys, is cultural property protection important? I think you would get a positive answer. We're never going to stop conflict, but we might be able to influence how it is acted out and how to begin to mitigate some of that damage and some of the loss. And while I say that's a final thought, my very, very final thought is to go back to the people first issue. I am absolutely convinced that I would never ask anybody to go out and do their job if it was going to put their lives at risk. The next slide is unfortunately already out of date, because all of these Syrian colleagues continued to do their job, and all of them have been killed trying to protect the cultural property that they had responsibility for in Syria. And unfortunately, as I say, this is now out of date, because we could add another 3 or 4 images to that slide. 6 killed by sniper, 2 by bomb, 1 executed or hanged and beheaded. That's a real issue around cultural property protection. It's one that I would never ask anybody to do, but it's one that these brave colleagues took on, and I find it an extraordinarily difficult slide to actually look at. But that's what we're talking about, and that's where I'm going to leave things now. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for this brilliant start of this workshop, in spite of the fact that I think that we will all agree that your last slides is giving us drives to home how horrible everything can get. I think that given the time, it would be better that we ask Peter questions while we are having dinner afterwards, because I would, in name of all the organizations, like to invite everybody to come to dinner with us afterwards. But first of all, I would like to, before we go to have dinner, I would like to invite Mr. Melikayas of the General Directorate for Culture, for Heritage and Museums to give us an opening speech of the workshop.